For our COBT listeners and viewers, it's Maynard and Mike here with a great planned discussion with a great friend, Ken Medlock over at the Baker Institute at Rice. Ken, I think we've been coming to you for macro energy thinking for, I don't know, it's probably been many years, I think in the double digits. But the Baker Institute is a group there under Ken's leadership that does so much great work, whether it's geopolitics or things related to technology or policy or national security issues. It's a wonderful place, and Ken, we're very lucky to have you as a friend. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No, it's a pleasure to be here, Maynard, and you guys do a phenomenal job. I don't need to really say that, so it's definitely my honor to be with you today.
Well, you're way too kind to us. I think Mike and I were talking about this conversation, and it's one of those unique situations, kind of like Mike Summers last week, where you can talk about a broad range of issues, and that's what we always feel like we need to do to better understand all this stuff. Go a little broad before you can figure out the narrow lanes.
Well, there are no shortage of things to dive into right now, particularly in the energy space. So happy to do this.
Well, Mike, before we jump in with Ken, what would you tell us about the markets or big picture, anything on your mind?
Sure. I'd say, if you want to just talk about markets today, I mean, they pretty much went sideways. You had bonds going sideways. The S&P was up a little bit and crude oil was down a little bit. So pretty much across the board, just really nothing happened today. Now, I really want to hit three areas. I mean, first of all, broader equity market front. The S&P is within 2% of its all-time high. Volatility is near its year-to-date lows. And what I'd say to that is a dangerous combination, all right? Because if anything unexpected comes out, and we've talked about Trumpitility all the time, if anything comes out of left field, you're going to have sharp moves in the market one way or the other. So just we're careful. We're concerned about that. And I say, the equity market's essentially being driven by two things: the big, beautiful budget bill, the ups and downs of that, and also basically policy and tariffs with Trump. I'd say from a bond market standpoint, the 10-year is at roughly 4.45%. It's traded sideways this week, but this week we're going to get CPI, PPI, initial jobless claims, and consumer sentiments. And so bond market volatility probably could pick up quite significantly this week. And the only reason we mention that is these economic reports are going to go a long way, because June 18th is going to be the next FOMC rate decision meeting. They're not expecting a cut at that meeting. I think the first cut is expected maybe in September timeframe. And so we'll see how these reports influence what the Fed is thinking on that date. As far as on the commodity front, I think the big surprise in commodities is crude oil. It's moved around $5 per barrel in the last couple of weeks. That's caught traders by a lot of surprise. I mean, sentiment from an investor standpoint and sentiment from a crude oil trader standpoint has been very, very negative. And a lot of that is the reason why crude oil has moved up, is just because it's been so negative. I'd say the couple things that we know, when we talk about on crude oil. First of all, the WTI curve is in backwardation through summer, but it's in contango, post-summer into 2026. And what that really is telling us is that, markets right now from a physical standpoint are strong, but markets are going to be anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million plus barrels in surplus in Q4 and into 2026. But like I said, a lot of traders got really bearish. They put on negative bets. Crude oil's moved against them, and so that's just kind of fed on itself. But the fundamentals in Q4 into 2026 do not look good. Last week, we had OPEC raise July production by another 400,000 barrels a day. Well, let me put it this way. Their stated production is 400,000 barrels a day. And as you know, the last 3 months, they basically have said that they're going to raise production by 1.2 million barrels a day. The only thing I would say to that is that 1.2 million barrels a day is not on the market. It's something significantly less. And I think the reason I'm saying that is that it's really going at, people are starting to think about what is OPEC's real spare capacity versus what they're saying is their stated capacity. If their real capacity is lower than the stated capacity, then that's a net bullish for markets. But we're not going to know. We're going to have to see in the next couple of months how much production is put on the market. I'd say the other reason we've seen crude oil move in the last week or so, you had Canadian wildfires. People are talking anywhere from 100 to 300,000 barrels a day of being impacted by that. That's a net positive. this U.S. Iran nuclear deal still is getting pushed to the side. So, that's an issue. And also, if you look at the U.S. oil rig count, it's down about 40 rigs over the last 2 weeks. That is much higher than people expected. In fact, today, basically, the EI came out with a short-term energy outlook, and they lowered their forecast for oil growth next year. In fact, they're saying that the oil is going to peak in the U.S. around 13.5 million barrels in Q2, and they have it going down to around 13.2, 13.3 million in mid to late 2026. So this whole drill baby drill, one of Trump's policies, that is clearly not going to be. It's not the case right now. Oil markets, once we got below 65, we saw oil rig count come down quite dramatically. So that's what we're dealing with. That's some of the things that are going on in the oil market. So with that, we'll just kind of pass it back to you.
Yeah, and there's a lot there. And Ken, I was thinking as we turn to you, and Mike, in our discussions this week around oil, you've been talking about some of those things, Mike. You've also mentioned, I think Russian production is down year over year. So if you start adding all this up, this overall weak tone in the oil market, coupled with a pretty good oil price week last week, it's an interesting environment. I'm just curious, the Baker Institute is so tapped in the Mideast and globally. What are you saying and thinking about oil price or oil markets right now?
A really interesting question. It's always the question, right? So we hosted, Sheikh Nawaf Al-Sabah, the CEO of Kuwait Petroleum, just about a month ago at the Baker Institute for a lecture and then a fireside chat. It's a really interesting conversation, but he made a statement that kind of resonated in many ways. He said there's a lot of discussion about weakness in the oil market, but every time he has a conversation with a customer, they ask for more. And I thought that was a really revealing statement and probably reflects a sentiment that is shared across a pretty broad swath of Middle East oil producers. They've really turned their focus towards developing Asian economies and the developing world in general with regard to how they're developing resources and thinking about marketing them. And I think that message that they're receiving is a little bit different than sometimes what we hear, on this side of the Atlantic. So, I kind of approach this with some caution. And I also have to always remind myself when I get into these kind of conversations, the best cure for low prices is low prices, just like the best cure for high prices is high prices. So if you get into a low price environment because there's concern about, the economic health of the global economy, that's going to cause rigs to back off, as you know, and that's going to lead to a negative sentiment with regard to the future outlook for supply. And that tends to ultimately lend itself to a self-correction.
I guess it's the great news about having a lot of the world's production in shale or short cycle projects is you start seeing the low prices can solve low prices quicker than they used to be able to, I guess, is the comment.
Without a doubt. You're not talking about, 5 to 7 year lead times for new projects to come online. You're talking about being able to drill and complete in half a month, right? So it's a totally different type of market.
Ken, can I ask you a question since you mentioned Kuwait? We were visiting about this last week with some friends, which is, if you look at Trump's tour, he went to Saudi, he went to UAE, he went to Qatar. You just don't seem to hear as much about Kuwait for whatever reason. I'm not saying anything good or bad, just observing it seems to be a quieter oil and gas province. Did you learn anything from that get together that gives you any Kuwait insights in particular?
Yeah, I mean, they have pretty significant plans to expand production. They're not looking to cut back. They're stepping out into the offshore. He made a joke that offshore in Kuwait is it's really shallow. So he said it's basically like wet production, not really deep water production. So it's a relatively low cost venture for them, and they're really looking to expand that production. The biggest impediment for that country to expand production is the way the budget is actually approved for KPC. It's approved by Parliament, and right now Parliament's suspended, so it means they can act a little differently. So that might actually mean you see them move a little bit more aggressively to expand production in the short to medium term. But there was no sentiment expressed in those dialogues that would indicate they're looking at a market that is in decline at all.
While we're in and around the Mideast, is there anything else you would add? There's so much going on. You obviously have the Israel, the Gaza conflict. You've got this these Iranian discussions we're having. You had this recent Trump visit. You've got the barrels that they're approving that don't seem to be coming on the market. I guess the Saudis have been laying down some rigs. There's been a lot moving around. Anything else you'd add to the Mideast discussion?
The only thing I think I could add to that conversation is we have to be able to distinguish between the short run and the long run. A lot of those countries, Saudi Arabia included, have a long view of the market. Obviously, price matters, particularly for the near term, given some of the budget pressures that they have internally. But they also don't view the market as a 6-month market. It's really about the next 20 to 30 years. And I think the positioning that they're taking is to establish a long-term customer base. So this idea that we need $100 oil, I think everybody in that region would like that, but they also understand that there is increasing competition on multiple margins for oil demand, and that kind of a market is probably not healthy for their long-term customer base. So as you look forward, I think they're going to be pretty ardent in trying to maintain security of demand. We often talk about security of supply, but security of demand for an oil exporting country is incredibly important, particularly to maintain its budget requirements, because we can't forget that is the lifeblood of those economies. Crude oil is. So the more they can produce and export long term, the better.
I was thinking, Ken, there was a change a couple of years ago. David Satterfield came in to lead the Baker Institute. He obviously had a State Department background and knowledge, and particularly the Mideast. Anything new or different you guys have been doing under David's leadership in any context? But I'm just thinking, with his background, he certainly has a lot of geopolitical instincts that are interesting to keep up with these days.
Oh yeah, I mean his geopolitical depth is unparalleled, really. He was under the last administration, appointed a special envoy for humanitarian affairs, in Israel, given the issues that are going on with Gaza. And he still, is in touch with what's going on there. I can't even begin to hazard a guess as to the depth of the issues that, he is engaged with, but it certainly has relevance for how we approach conversations in the region. We constantly get requests to talk about a variety of things. In Israel, of course, there still is a tremendous interest in developing the natural gas resources, offshore there. Fact of the matter is, though, until things are resolved or at least settled down, there's just way too much uncertainty for a lot of Western capital to flow into those opportunities. So it's really kind of a stalemate right now, if you will, because there's not a lot of appetite to sink capital into an area that is fraught with that kind of uncertainty and quite frankly, violence. And it pushes you into other parts of the world. And it's interesting, and I think you've seen this from the Trump administration, the way you mentioned visits, to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, discussions with Iran, trying to get a nuclear deal done. A lot of this is really about ensuring that there is some amount of stability in the region so that there's not a massive disruption in the energy markets. I mean, if you think about when he ran, what was one of the things he constantly said? Lower prices at the pump. That in many ways is inconsistent with a healthy, domestic upstream sector. But by the same token, if he can actually deliver on some of the promises with regard to permitting and some of the regulatory easing that he's been looking at, then those things might actually wash in the mix, and you could end up with a relatively stable U.S. upstream in a lower price environment, and one that is ultimately healthy for the Middle East as well. So, Ambassador Satterfield has really stayed in touch with us. Anytime a major announcement comes up, he's obviously reaching out and asking questions about, a variety of things. The most recent, of course, was the suspension of the elimination, I should say, of the grants, right? The recent announcement by the administration, 3.7 billion, something like that. He had some obvious questions about that, but in reality, and this is something we shared, that has implications for specific projects in the United States, but connection to oil, not so much, obviously. It actually, in many ways, reduces a competitive margin for, domestic oil production over the short to medium term. But by the same token, it's not going to make or break carbon capture, which is really the long-term sort of future for a lot of oil producers in the United States. They're still focused on that, and 45Q is still in play. So, you think about the variety of things that are going on. I feel like I've just kind of run around the world real fast, but there's just so much to talk about, and it's all so deeply interconnected. You can't talk about one thing without connecting it to others.
Well, I was thinking there was a lot in there I wanted to grab onto. Mike, jump in here. One more from me. You mentioned carbon capture, and carbon capture, it's this unique animal where there's a lot of discussion. It's something that is a legitimate thing that is talked about as being very important, but it's also something where when you dig into it, I guess the question is, what is really the state of the technology? Where are we with it? Are there things you're doing in and around carbon capture that the question we get is, what would really be the cost of power, natural gas power with carbon capture? And you can get a broad range of answers, but what's your latest thinking on carbon capture?
Technically, we know how to do it. We've been capturing CO2 and re-injecting it for enhanced oil recovery for decades. This is not a new sort of development. Technologically, it's very doable. That's not the hurdle, though. The hurdle is cost, because anytime you start talking about a carbon capture project, really all you're doing is adding cost to the project. And that is ultimately where the proverbial rubber hits the road, because you still have to be able to turn a profit, earn a rate of return on invested capital, all the things that you guys know very well and talk about quite often. And that's where carbon capture really faces a significant hurdle, a steep hurdle. However, it's still sort of out there that with enough deployment and enough scale, there are perhaps opportunities that could be realized that aren't on the table yet. One of those is thinking about ways to capture carbon to value. So this is the idea that if I can turn it, from a cost sink into a revenue generator, then all of a sudden this conversation is a completely different conversation, because now you're not talking about just adding cost to a project. You're actually talking about using carbon or CO2, however you want to approach this, right, as an input into another production process, either advanced materials or advanced chemistries. And I'm fortunate at Rice to be able to see a lot of really cool stuff that's going on both of those fronts. That I think has promise over the long term. It's obviously not a next 5 to 7 year type of time horizon, but next 15 to 20, yeah, who knows? And then the entire discussion about hydrocarbons is completely turned upside down, quite frankly, because now you're actually talking about carbon as a value add. I joke a lot about this, but Mother Nature figured out carbon to value long before we were ever even here, right? So it's photosynthesis. If we could figure out a way to use that in the built environment, it would make for a very different outlook on hydrocarbons in general, but also the future of energy.
Hey, Ken, I was going to talk to you about OPEC policy, but Maynard really kind of brought us back to the U.S., so we'll concentrate on that. I think about the big beautiful bill that basically went through the House. A lot of that was gutted. A lot of the tax incentive credit for renewables was sort of, it was gutted pretty well. And maybe some thought from you about what you think comes out of the Senate and what ultimately happens. That's number one. And the second question is, it sounded like today that Trump is looking tomorrow or Thursday to basically, I don't know if eliminate, but do away with some of these EPA emission rules on power plants. Maybe, what that means, what some of these renewable plans, what does this mean for just, gas production, electricity, and just what is your thought process of how you basically model that, how you think about the next couple of years?
Ooh, to be honest with you, with the House of the big beautiful bill, I tend to not dive too deeply into proposed legislation until there's something really firm, because that's a rabbit hole you can get lost in. And thankfully, the Senate has the ability to think about things in a little bit more sort of rational way. I don't know how else to say that. The House sort of moves in 2-year increments, so it really is always about placating a base, because you're basically in the next election cycle, after you're sworn in. So the Senate, on the other hand, we've got a 6-year window, so they can tend to be a little bit more rational and think a little bit more deeply about things. So I tend to, because of that, lean into the Senate's going to rationalize some of the things that came out of the House bill. What that looks like, though, I'm not 100% sure. There is a pretty strong emphasis, and this includes from Trump. And we know that if you go against Trump right now, he's gonna rally hard and basically threaten primary challenges. So if you're coming up on an election, it's usually not a position you want to be in, particularly not in this political environment. But I think you're going to see some pullback as much as possible on some of the tax credits. Now, some of this stuff is a little bit more difficult to do, absent a reconciliation package, which is where we are right now, because it has a distinct budget implication. But if it doesn't get through in this window, it's probably not going to. So I think everybody's kind of waited on bated breath, if you will, to see what happens. But if, let's take the extreme example. Let's say a lot of this stuff does get undone. You'll definitely see a slowdown in the wind and solar industries. You'll see a slowdown probably to a lesser extent in the battery industry, largely because batteries are benefiting dramatically from increased wholesale price volatility in power markets. And that has to do with intermittent resources, which are much more prevalent in markets right now. In Texas, for example, you're looking at returns on investments in batteries that are less than 3 years in some cases. That's pretty phenomenal. That's like a license to print money. So you're still going to see a lot of interest there, just because batteries are really good at being able to, arb that intraday price volatility that is so prevalent now in wholesale power markets. So it's going to be a mixed bag. I think what's going to be really interesting, though, coming out of back into this is what it means for things like geothermal, what it means for distributed generation assets. A lot of people like to talk about small modular nuclear, stuff like that, micronuclear. I mean, I don't expect a whole lot of deployment in the next 2 to 4 years on that front, because there's a big regulatory spider web that needs to be, unwound and navigated. So to me, that's a longer play, but this administration can certainly do something to, pave the road for those types of technologies to have a really big impact. Geothermal is a different issue, though, because there are some projects that are already underway and could easily be expanded. It really is just about where you have the right rock, where the geology is good. And interestingly, you're using the same technologies that you're using in the shale patch. So in many ways, so it's an interesting space to think about. You can envision a future where the Loan Program Office has a bigger role to play in advanced nuclear and geothermal tech. I don't really see a lot of appetite for expanding tax credits and other types of subsidy instruments like that. But who knows? I mean, the policy sausage making is sort of always interesting, to say the least. But in a world where those tax incentives are unwound, you're going to see a big interest in expanding natural gas. There are some supply chain issues that are very prevalent there. For example, the ability to, deploy turbines fast enough. There's back orders on that front. There's a whole lot of commercial issues that will get in the way ultimately of really moving things rapidly. And of course, this is all running headlong into what's happening at the state level and local level. Because when you get into power generation, which is where all these things touch, there are levers that states and local regulators can pull as well. So to what extent they take steps to offset the removal or reduction of tax incentives, I think it'll go state by state, and that remains to be seen. But by no means is the federal lever the only lever to pull. There are other things that I think we will ultimately see happen in the interest of maintaining reliability on grids.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, because it feels to me that we need every piece of generation, every piece of everything over the next 4 or 5 years, given the electricity demand that we're expecting to see. So, if you have less renewables, it's going to be more reliance on natural gas. The supply chains aren't there till probably 2029, 2030. And now, obviously, Trump is looking at basically, suspend some of these, I don't know if suspend is the right word, some of these pollution rules, because we're going to need some of those coal plants to be extended for the next 8, 9, 10 years. And I would just point to, several weeks back, the MISO capacity auction, where, you had summer of 2025 prices of $665 a megawatt or a kilowatt. That's a 20-fold increase since last year. And so that's telling you that we are definitely supply short, demand long. And so, what are your thoughts there? It just seems to all make sense that we're going to need every molecule out there, every piece of generation.
Yeah, this is where, interestingly, this conversation connects all the way back to oil. And I say that because when you think about reliability services on grids, one of the sort of least cost and quickest to deploy generation assets is short cycle diesel. You've got these diesel gen sets that can actually be deployed and called upon in periods where the market gets really tight, and they're low fixed cost. They're not expensive assets. You're seeing a lot of interest from industrials, including data centers, to deploy these as backup. Now that's starting to emerge, and it kind of gets back to what you just said. We need everything, right? And certainly, if you start to see some relaxation on those EPA air quality standards, that opens a window for some of those small diesel gen sets to actually be deployed more aggressively. So, it's definitely an interesting space to think about. But if that happens, it gives you an additional demand impetus at the top end of the barrel that's going to be interesting to see how the market actually plays that.
I was thinking as you guys were talking about that stuff, one of the things that's been interesting going on, it happened last week in Alaska. You had Doug Burgum, Chris Wright, and Lee Zeldin all together. And I guess the reason I highlight this is I don't recall, you might recall, Ken, when any administration had sort of Interior, Secretary of Energy, and EPA all kind of synced up around what are we doing, what are the answers, and I'm sure there are people who might think it's not good that they're all synced up like this, but I'm just observing to see those three departments synced up, trying to work together, at least around energy and energy availability. It's kind of a unique thing. Or what is your perspective on that, Ken?
It is, but it isn't. And let me explain that. You think about what Trump did. He created this Energy Council, right? And the idea there was to create basically an umbrella around all things energy so that there'd be better coordination across agencies. And I think that's what you're seeing play out, just to be blunt. The irony here is if you think back to Winter Storm Uri in the state of Texas, when the lights went out for, 3 to 5 days, depending on where you were. One of the biggest criticisms of the state was a lack of coordination among state agencies that oversaw the regulatory architecture between gas and power. And that was addressed directly in the legislature. So, the irony is at the federal level, we haven't ever seen that, but now we are. And I would argue that it's welcome. quite frankly, to actually have some coordination across agencies on issues as important as energy. You know, I'm going to kind of take us on a little aside here because I think it's very relevant to everything we've been talking about. But we had a conference last week that was focused on minerals, materials, supply chains in the sort of new energy space, if you will. And it was really interesting because my job was to just kind of sit and listen to all of the discussions that were going on about issues related to either nearshoring, onshoring, developing new supply chains, really thinking about electrification at large. And it kind of occurred to me that really what we were talking about was an element of energy security that I think for the better part of the last few decades has been lost. And that is supply chain resilience. If you think about what secure energy supplies are all about, it really is about that, right? And if you think about what governments can do, and I think this is where your question kind of fits in, there's really 6 levers that we often talk about when we talk about supply chain resilience. One is inventory management. And so what do governments do when they step into that space? You talk about strategic stocks, right? So this is where if you go back to the 1970s with the oil embargo, we got into, the creation of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and then that's been debated about how it should be used, ever since. But make no mistake, that is about deploying an inventory or an inventory tool so that you can manage supply chain disruptions. Another one is diversification of suppliers and offtake. So this is where you get into promoting free trade, promoting international investment, promoting domestic investment. We've touched on the latter 2 of those in this conversation already. International investment with Trump's visits abroad. Domestic investment. This is where the coordination across these agencies really becomes, I think, very important. But at the end of the day, it's really about how you diversify that portfolio of energy supplies so that you can ensure that energy is available at lower cost as possible. Free trade is another issue. We don't have to get into that one, but it certainly does remove barriers to different forms of energy that historically are important for the U.S. government to explore. Technology adoption and process innovation for operational efficiencies. That's where you get into R&D. It remains to be seen what this administration is going to do on the R&D front with the sort of scaling back of some of the grant expenditures. I think that it doesn't look good, but I'm going to just kind of pause because you never know. Sort of once the dust settles as we move through the latter half of this year, what's going to ultimately happen with the national labs and what's going to happen with dedicated R&D expenditures through like the Department of Energy, for example. Strong counterparty relationships. That's where you get into diplomacy. I will say this: the dissolution of the Bureau of Energy Resources at the Department of State is a move in the wrong direction. Because if you think about the reason that department was established within the State Department, it was specifically because the U.S. government started to realize every time they walked into a room, as you move into the late 2000 knots, early 2010s, all the counterparties want to know what's going on in shale, right, and when it was going to be available for export. It really changed the position of the U.S. government in diplomatic discourse, and that that department was actually doing a lion's share of work with regard to thinking about things that are going on in Ukraine, for example, and other places around the world. So, dissolving that department and sort of rolling it back into economics is, I think, it's a little bit short-sighted. I'll just be blunt. Transportation networks and logistics management tools. This is where you get into things like port expansion, emphasis on reducing constraints on domestic and international commerce. This administration is hinting at really trying to drive investments in those directions. So that could be a good thing at the end of the day for energy. And then, quite frankly, understanding risks. And this is where you get into, again, back to the Energy Council idea. Dedicated study and engagement with industry along the entire value chain. And I think that's where this Energy Council idea could actually bear some significant fruit, because having your ear open to what every part of the value chain across the energy industry is actually saying, can actually help you identify risks and navigate them much more successfully so that you avoid, unexpected dislocations and ultimately things that can derail the U.S. economy. So, there's still a lot to sort of unpack. And I like the word, I think, that was used a minute ago, trumpetility. That is certainly one that is relevant. You probably know this. It's hard to put a presentation together about anything on energy right now, because if you're asked to submit it a week in advance, you have to tell the conference organizers, well, get ready. It might be totally different. So
no, it's totally true. I was thinking, like, last week's story was the big, beautiful bill and the fight with Musk about it. And it would just, and then these, feels like the problems in LA just completely obliterated that whole discussion. And you do feel that way. Like, what are we talking about in a couple more days? I was going to grab one thing you were mentioning there. You talked about trade and free trade and commercial relationships. And in the energy system, one that's always, or it's been on our mind a lot, is just the U.S. Canadian, in particular, sort of interconnectivity and how the two countries are. There's a lot of great synergies there, and we've got all these problems with the relationship. How are you thinking about that U.S. Canadian energy partnership and how we get through the current issues? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually wrote about this earlier this year in a report that was focused on natural gas and LNG. But one of the things that's often missed in the various analyses that have been done around, sanctioning exports from the United States, is the role that Canada actually plays in backstopping U.S. gas supply. There's a long, historical, very deep relationship between the U.S. and Canada on natural gas trade. And there's a lot of resource in Canada that is untapped. It's stranded, for lack of a better way to put it right now, largely because there are no other outlets. Now, they are working diligently to try to expand LNG exports out the West Coast, but there's an important point about all this that I think even this administration is missing, which is namely that if you do see upward pressure on price in the lower 48, that Canadian resource can very easily step in to backfill that supply deficit that's leading to that upward pressure and ultimately help stabilize the U.S. market. It's often why people in the gas industry don't talk about the U.S. market, they talk about the North American market, right? Because all three countries are actually deeply connected. Mexico is largely an importer and consumer, but the supplier consumer relationship between the U.S. and Canada is long and deep and flows both ways. So, unfortunately, right now there's a bit of a rift between the two governments, but I think that's quite frankly opens an opportunity for the commercial actors in the space to try to shore up relationships so that when things do calm out, I think you can see a healthier economic relationship between the two nations, particularly on the energy front.
I was thinking on the oil markets, Mike, in some of the conversations about what's going on with Iran. We had that Monday announcement that the IAEA is now viewing Iran as farther along in its nuclear activities than maybe we'd previously discussed. But I think that the feeling was, for forever in our history, oil often had this premium in it associated with something bad might happen. There'd be sort of a risk premium. And when you start getting into conversations like what's going on with Iran, you start thinking about that risk premium again. So I guess it's two questions. This Iran thing, how do you think about how should we think about the potential for real conflict there? And then how do you think about the oil markets and the potential that some sort of significant or meaningful risk premium comes back into oil price?
Wow, that's a lot. But look, I think to some extent, the risk risks associated with Iran and conflict in the region have largely been priced into the marketplace. I mean, we with the attacks at Abqaiq a few years ago, we saw a pretty robust response initially, and then we also saw how resilient Aramco was with sort of managing that damage, so that their supplier, the relationship with off-takers was really maintained in a really healthy and robust way, and then the market kind of settled out really quickly. But I think that was a shock to the system that as far as I know, or as far as I can see, hasn't really been sort of removed. I think the risk is not so much that there's something new on that front. It's more, what if Iran does actually successfully test a nuclear weapon, right? If they were actually to be able to do that, and let's say the IAEA is correct and they are much farther along, and we're not looking at any time in the next 3 to 5 months, but sometime over the next 3 to 4 years, if that were to happen, I think you'd see a significant impact in the marketplace, because now there would be a real concern about the potential for disruption, and certainly at the very least, it changes the negotiating stance with regard to any sort of movement of energy, through the Strait of Hormuz. So you end up in a very different kind of dialogue if that happens, which is why, quite frankly, and I think there's a lot of interest in the region for this to happen. It's imperative that some sort of deal gets done, right? And that it's honored. Absent that, I think the status quo is whatever risk is certainly priced into the market, currently priced into the market right now, remains priced in. But I think and Mike was referring to this earlier. The net supply situation in the global market is not one that's going to lend itself to, quite frankly, a lot of upward price pressure, even with that risk, because there's just a lot of depth in the global supply situation right now, a lot of different supplies that can move. And so you've got OPEC, OPEC plus, I should say, pushing to expand production. So at the end of the day, if you continue to see stocks build around the world, then that risk gets muted. To me, the bigger risk is if Iran was actually to successfully test a nuclear weapon. I think if that happens, that's game changing. Then we're in a completely different world at that point. But absent that, I think the status quo holds. It's not one that I think makes a lot of people overly comfortable, to say the least, especially not in the region. But as long as the U.S. is engaged, as long as there are active discussions that are attempted to really talk about Iran's nuclear program, I think that the market will continue to sort of move along as it always has.
So this is a tough question. Do you think, I'll ask both of you, do you think people, because the risk the way the risk could start changing is you start thinking an Israeli strike might happen on Iran, as if they're getting closer. Somebody decides they've got to do something preemptive. Do we think the world believes that the Trump administration could restrain the Israelis from doing that, and that's why we don't see, because you kind of described something a little bit binary, Ken, like we are where we are until these guys test for a weapon. But I don't know, Mike, you should take it, but see what you think there.
Well, I think, when I think about it from just a market standpoint, I don't worry too much about Iran. And the reason why I don't worry too much about Iran is, just from a global oil pricing standpoint, is they only have around 200,000 or 300,000 barrels more that they probably can put on the market. It's not another million they can put on the market. So when I think about them getting a nuclear weapon, or Israel hitting them, or the U.S. sanctioning them, that means prices are biased to the upside, not the downside. So I don't think there's much of a premium in there for Iran. What I do think is interesting, and maybe Ken can talk a little bit about this, is that in April, OPEC Plus surprised people by accelerating the production adds, right? Crude oil went from low 70s to low 60s. Obviously, they did 2 more increases. And I guess my question for you is, everyone really knows that Saudi really controls OPEC. They drive the decision making in OPEC. And they have been one where I don't think they've been a price-related strategy. I think they've been more of a what do inventories on a global basis look like, and they're really, really low right now. So if they were going to put oil on the markets, now is the right time to put oil on the market. And I guess my question for you is, given what's going on right now, what is their thinking? Because they seem to have gone from that, oil inventories are low. Some people thinking it's price related to they want to balance markets to one now. It's like we can put, we're taking market share. Do you think that is really the truth? I mean, is it something else that's going, some dynamics that are going on in the next 3, 4, 5 months that they're saying if not now, when? I mean, what are your thoughts there?
So a couple things. I'll come back to that specific question. But with regard to Israel, the reason I didn't really bring that up, Maynard, is because we saw, and I think this is part of the Iranian calculus and the way they actually approach this entire issue now. We saw that the Israelis could actually hit whatever they wanted to hit in Iran earlier this year. And that was a message because, they could have actually gone after some much more strategic infrastructure, but they didn't. And so, yes, I think there was some coordination likely with the U.S. administration. And so some restraint was actually exercised. And certainly we didn't see an escalation. We're still seeing escalation by proxy, but we did not see an escalation when that event happened. So, that's why I kind of didn't dive into that, because I still think that the status quo is the most likely sort of outcome. And I actually do agree that the downside risk on price is pretty minimal, just because the Iranians can't really ramp up production in the near term in any significant way. With regard to OPEC plus actions, it's interesting. I actually teach this in class. There's a game theoretic approach to understanding oil production by a dominant producer like OPEC or OPEC plus. And one of the interesting things that happens under certain circumstances is kind of what you're seeing right now. So envision a world where you think about the U.S. as on the competitive fringe, and there's a long, flat supply curve, so very elastic supply. And the dominant firm, which is OPEC plus in this case, is trying to figure out whether or not they should increase or cut production because they're trying to, find a sort of a comfortable price environment for themselves. Well, they might experiment due to lack of information with cutting production for a while, but if they actually see that they're not getting an increase in price, but they're actually sacrificing market share, then the optimal strategy for them is to do the exact opposite, which is ramp up production, because then it becomes a market share game, not so much a price game. And in that type of environment, you do see some modest downward pressure on price, but not a lot, largely because it's that competitive fringe that becomes the price setting agent in that market. And that's a really long, flat supply curve. So effectively what you do is you chase out at the margin some of those, higher cost producers. You recapture market share and price doesn't move much. And we actually go through this in my class early in the spring. And so it was kind of funny because we got towards the end of the semester and a bunch of my students started coming to me and saying, is this what's happening? And I said, well, anytime you can use a relatively simple framework to sort of talk about what's going on in the market and it explains 95% of what you see, I kind of opt to, well, let's keep with the simple discussion. It doesn't need to be about geopolitics or making deals with the Trump administration. It could just be pure economics. And to me, that's what you're seeing right now.
Ken, we mentioned this in the upfront, the Baker Institute. You guys always have, you've got double-digit number of analysts. I need to get the latest number from you, but you've always got people looking into all kinds of different things. Anything you tell us about, the latest, the newest, the new things, or the things that are increasingly of interest over at Baker?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that question, Maynard. We've got about 50 people on staff in different capacities now.
Wow.
We've really been ramping up, and this is really across 10 different programs. I kind of referred to in kind of many ways what we do on oil and natural gas, but we also have a pretty heavy footprint in geopolitics on a regional basis. So in the Middle East, on Latin America, Asia, stepping into Central Europe in particular as well. We also have a program on energy, minerals, and materials, which I sort of referenced earlier in the discussion about that conference, which has been a growth area for us. It's been a really interesting space because people are really trying to wrestle with kind of what I said earlier is how do you actually build resilient supply chains so that you can actually do some of the things that are being aspired to be done around the world. And it's not a simple process at all. We have a pretty robust program on sustainability and resilience. And this really connects pretty deeply with petrochemicals and plastics. That's been a kind of a fun one to watch grow because my colleague Rachel Meidel was having a conversation with a group at the Texas Medical Center, and they were of course interested in plastics and what that meant for their sustainability efforts, but they didn't really connect until she really pointed out that plastics are an energy problem. At the end of the day, you're talking about a petrochemical product, and I think that's where it kind of created this resonance within the medical community that we've really been able to sort of tap into. It's been a really fun sort of exercise because people are starting to realize that everything's connected. It's really that simple. We also have a pretty robust program on transportation, which is heavily focused on commercial transport, so freight, movement by rail, air, ship, deep engagement with ports around the world as a result of that exercise, and makes for a lot of really fun conversations because so much happens in and around ports that most people are just not conscious of, that if it fails, we're in a world of mess. And it makes it a really, really important area to really pay really close attention to. And it kind of steps into the trade dynamics and all sorts of other things. But it's remarkable because if you think back to end of 2020 and early 2021, we were coming out of the COVID shutdowns and everybody all of a sudden got reminded what a supply chain was. And I was kind of hopeful I wouldn't have to get to a point where we're re-educating people about supply chains, but it kind of seems like we've forgotten already in many regards. And that's unfortunate because what happens in and around ports is incredibly important for everything that we do every day. So yeah, a lot of different areas of research. They're all exciting. We actually just launched a new data visualization platform where we're looking at a whole variety of things through a different lens. I mean, you know this, a picture can tell 1,000 words, right? And if you can do something that's robust through graphics, it's remarkable in terms of how it can elevate conversations and move the needle on policy discourse. So highly encourage everyone to check that stuff out. We just launched one actually yesterday on natural disaster resilience, which is eye-opening. Because one of the things you can see, for example, if you plot hurricanes from 1950 all the way through today, you can look at the tracks, the wind roses, the strength. So the wind rose is sort of the extent to which the winds actually move out from the eye path, and also the strengths of the storms. The decade of the 50s doesn't look a hell of a lot different than last decade. But what's remarkably different is the expanse of urban tracts and the increase in population density in Gulf Coast areas. And that really is eye-opening to a lot of people who we've kind of beta tested this with because they didn't realize that. But, it's a classic example. If you build a lot of stuff in Hurricane Alley, more of that stuff's going to get damaged. So it gets you into a mindset of thinking about building more resilient infrastructure. So there's a lot of stuff that we're doing that connects to the energy industry and understanding where energy infrastructure is located and how it sort of intersects with all of those dialogues.
Well, look, maybe as we wrap up, you're always so generous with your time and your thoughts. One thing, we happened to be out at Stanford last week. We happened to connect with the U Chicago. They have a Energy Institute this week. I think one thing we always find interesting is how the energy, call it the biorhythms are on our campuses, meaning, students, are they interested in energy? Do they want to study it? Do they want to study it in total? Is it more about the transition type mindset, or what would you say you've noticed with Rice students and attitudes around energy, say today versus, over the last few years? What kind of change do you feel?
At Rice, and I think there's probably a bit of sample selection bias here because we're in Houston, students have maintained a very healthy interest in energy. It's broadened, obviously, over the last 2 decades. There's a lot more interest in renewables. There's a lot more interest in batteries and storage, the electricity industry in general. But there's still a healthy interest in oil and gas. There's still a healthy interest in understanding how energy commodities in particular, move and how they're ultimately used. So it's kind of a fun place to be because a lot of the students that are here are looking to get jobs with companies that, call Houston home. And we are in the energy capital of the world. So we get a very broad swath of interests. The one thing I will say that has been probably the most interesting to watch evolve is how geographic interests vary. So students who are from the Middle East, who are from Africa, Asia, very strong interest in oil and gas. Students from Latin America, kind of a mixed bag. A lot of interest in renewables, a lot of interest in oil and gas, a lot of interest in energy transitions and decarbonization. Students from Europe, most heavily, their interest lies really in the renewable domains, in the electricity domains. In the U.S., it really depends on where the students are from. If they're from the East or West Coast, they kind of look like Europe. If from the sort of middle part of the U.S., they look more like students from, Africa and Middle East and Asia. So it's kind of, it's interesting because if you look at energy infrastructure around the world, it very much mirrors what I just talked about.
Yeah, it's like you look like your hometown grid.
That's exactly right. I mean, and you
really
think about it, if you think about it, if a particular industry has been the lifeblood of your household, you're going to have a very different viewpoint towards it than if it hasn't been. And I think what we're seeing right now is that geographic reflection, much more than political, but geographic reflection coming through in our students today.
That's fascinating. Ken, you're such a stud. We really appreciate you and all the work you guys are doing, and we love staying connected with you guys, and we're always watching when the new stuff comes out. We're always excited to have you and your team come on the show. So thank you so much.
Absolutely, man. It's been a pleasure to be here, and keep up the great work. Close of Business is probably one of the best podcasts that there is out there. So really glad to be able to join you. I'm
going to take that clip and send it to my relatives. Make sure they saw that one. Thank you, Ken.
Very
Thanks,
good.
everybody.